Well, hey everyone, and welcome to my apartment on this rainy Tuesday. This is part two of a series Barb and I did where we both went over the 6 verses in the Bible used to marginalize the gay community. We did this on Sunday, but Barb and I realized that the live stream, as it was recording, the quality of it was really bad. So we both figured this message was important enough to take some time out of our week to redo. And Barb and I are going to cover different verses. In part 1, Barb is covering verses with Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis and the viceless in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. And here in part 2, I'll be covering the verses in Leviticus and Romans. And Barb and I believe this was important enough just because of how we've seen the Bible get used to justify some really nasty stuff. And we've both had a good amount of experiences ministering to people who have had the Bible used against them. And as you can imagine, it's brought up in our professional setting a bunch as well. So for instance, I remember grabbing coffee with a minister, and after some conversation, it became extremely apparent that we both were in different camps when it came to what the Bible should or should not say about the gay community. And as we were talking, they explicitly mentioned the verses in Leviticus, and they got really frustrated with me. I just remember them staring down at their coffee and just saying, "Alex, I really don't understand how you justify your faith." So, to that minister and to anyone who'd like language to put to their faith, it's time to dive into the Clobber passages speed dating style. We're going to get to know these verses' favorite color, but we won't spend long enough to know their whole family history. And listen, I'd love to talk about these things for longer, so if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to follow up with us. But in the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to be covering the passages in Leviticus. And there are 2 in Leviticus frequently used to marginalize gay people. In the NRSV, they get translated like this. Leviticus 18:22, "And you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." In Leviticus 20:13, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They should be put to death. Their blood is upon them." So those verses at face value, I'm sure, seem really shocking. But what I find comforting and encouraging as I continually study to learn about faith, religion, and the Bible, and to learn from scholars who have studied those things, I'm encouraged that I don't have to run away or expend a ton of energy doing mental gymnastics to push something to the side or to justify something. These verses in Leviticus aren't mistranslated. And from scholars I've read, there isn't any weight to the argument that these verses are actually about pedophilia. So the question then becomes, how do we understand these verses? And I suggest that we can't read them apart from their ancient context in our current context. Because Leviticus is better described by its early rabbinic name, and excuse me as I butcher this, but the name is Torat Kohanim, also known as the Priest's Manual. Colbie Martin, author of the book on Clobber, talks about Leviticus like this. "Leviticus is a collection of commandments and laws compiled for the priestly tribe, the Levites, who were responsible for the religious aspects of their community." And that's what Leviticus is. And also, why probably a lot of us have not read the entirety of the book of Leviticus. It's okay to be honest about that. It's a book of laws made for the Levites to understand how to follow rituals and take care of their new community of former slaves. And listen, this doesn't mean that Leviticus is not important. It just means that we should have different expectations of this book based on how the book itself acts. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Scholar Dan McClellan has this to say about these verses in Leviticus. He says, "These texts are condemning specific and limited acts of same-sex intercourse, but there is nothing legitimate about generalizing ancient prohibitions to today." And he lists a few reasons as to why he says it's not legitimate. He says, one, we know these prohibitions were built upon entirely false concepts of human sexuality. Two, we know they build upon long abandoned concepts of social hierarchy and sexual ethics. And three, we know this isn't a condemnation on all homosexuality because Leviticus omits female same-sex intercourse. And out of those points, I want to focus on ancient social hierarchy and sexual ethics and the omission of female same-sex intercourse. Peace USA scholar Jack Rogers states this: male superiority in ancient Israel had to be maintained. We find in Leviticus that actions undermining male gender superiority incur the death penalty. So, things like a child who cursed his parents could be put to death. And adultery was punishable by death because it was an unlawful use of a woman who was a man's property. And engaging in this specific homosexual act was punishable by death because a man took a passive role in sex, which they believed to be the role assigned to the woman. They felt it was to victim the man, to put him in what they deemed to be a feminizing role. You see, the system of the ancient world was patriarchal. It was governed, ruled, and controlled by men. So, any attempts on someone's part to generalize the scripture to today requires that person to pick and choose which parts of that patriarchal social hierarchy and sexual ethic they want to preserve or add to. And if someone is picking and choosing based on personal interest, then that says more about that person than it does the Bible. Second point, neither verse ever mentioned lesbians. Colbie Martin, author of the book on Clobber, writes this: if we accept that these two Clobber passages were inserted into Israel's Holiness Code book for the purpose of informing all humanity for all time about the divine prohibition against all homosexuality, then why are female same-sex acts never addressed? Colbie Martin writes that then these verses suggest a nuanced or situational prohibition as opposed to an across-the-board law against any and all sex acts between men. You see, when it comes to the Bible, often the Bible isn't the problem. It's our expectations of what we expect the Bible to do that becomes problematic. And if we expect Leviticus to offer us, people 2,000 plus years removed from the cultures and times of the priestly tribe of the Levites, for this book to offer us a wholesale description on how to live our lives in the 21st century, well, that's just an expectation too big for this book to bear. Now, we're going to start diving in to our passage in Romans. And this is a biggie. Romans is huge. Throughout the history of Christianity, Romans is like the backbone. So many theological shifts came out of the book of Romans. So to deal with our passage in Romans today, I am going to need you to allow me a moment of nerdiness. You see, in a galaxy far, far away, Star Wars, Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi, we get the famous Battle of Endor. And you know the one, with the cute little Ewoks running around. Well, before the Ewoks, we get a scene in the movie where the rebel forces believe they've turned the tide on the Empire. Lando Calrissian and Admiral Akbar are going to ambush the Empire. They believe they have the upper hand when, out of nowhere, they realize they've been duped. Empire starships come storming out of the sky. Red lasers start firing, and Admiral Akbar yells his famous line, "It's a trap!" All right. Paul, in the book of Romans, is going to set a similar trap for his audience. You see, Paul's audience in the book of Romans is Jewish and Gentile Christians. And the problem is, Jewish and Gentile Christians had a hard time getting along. Judaism had a long, long history of believing they were the sole people in a covenant with God. And they followed close observance to their law, which required a lot from them. And anyone who didn't observe their law or even broke it, well, they were unclean, outcasts, or outsiders. And that's what they thought of the Gentiles. So their observance to their law came with an air of superiority. And so when Jesus came and proclaimed that the kingdom of God was for everyone, there needed to be restructuring of power, restructuring of the church. And unfortunately, they didn't have the Presbyterian mantra decently and in order to get them through this time. The big debates were like, what role do Gentiles have in Israel's story? And do Gentiles need to adopt Jewish practices and ways? And it was a mess. So Paul in the book of Romans is going to be unifying these people, unifying these two groups. Paul wants both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians to understand that they are on equal footing. Nobody is better than the other. So, if then Paul is going to do just that, unify these groups, then he's going to have to level the playing field. He's going to need to convince his audience that nobody is better than anybody else. And Paul does this in a few ways. In Romans 1:16 through 17, Paul's going to state his idea of the gospel when he writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." So Paul is starting to make his case. The gospel is for everyone, Jew and Gentile. And here's where we get an interesting next 15 verses. Paul's going to go into a description of a few things. One, about God's wrath, and two, about whom will be the recipients of God's wrath. And what we may be missing is that in this following 15 verses, Paul is listing and describing a lot of practices done by Gentiles of the time. Practices involving idol worship, sexual practices that weren't custom to Jewish people. And maybe you can already see the trap forming. You see, because in this 15 verses, Paul is going to say they are the idolaters. They degrade themselves. Paul and the Jewish Christians feel they have the upper hand. In these 15 verses about God's wrath on Gentile practices, Paul's Jewish audience feels like maybe they've ambushed the Gentiles. Scholar Peter N. says, in these 15 verses, you can almost hear his Jewish audience in the background yelling, "Yeah, you go get him, Paul." And if they only had Admiral Akbar to let them know, it's a trap! Because after these 15 verses, in steps chapter 2, where Paul says, "Therefore you have no excuse when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, are doing the very same things." Paul's going to level the playing field. Any air of superiority any of his Jewish listeners may have felt in chapter 1 gets obliterated in chapter 2 and 3. Paul addresses them saying that they do the same things as the Gentiles. And in verse 19 of chapter 2, which is really, this section is like really hard not to read sarcastically, Paul writes, "And if you are so sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in the darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law of embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then that teach others, will you not teach yourself?" Oh man. Paul's basic address is this: just because you have the law doesn't make you better than Gentiles. Presbyterian scholar Jack Rogers writes, Paul is driving home a point to both Gentile and Jewish listeners that no one is righteous before God. Scholar Daniel Kirk says that if you want to understand Paul's basic point in the book of Romans, go to chapter 3, verse 23, where we have the famous line that I'm sure we all know, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." Daniel Kirk says that if you want to understand Paul's point, replace the word all for both. Both have sinned. both have fallen short. Both Jewish and Gentile Christians. And okay. This was a lot of background, and I understand if you didn't follow me through it all. And you're probably saying, Alex, what do the things that you were talking about have to do with our problematic verses? Well, I believe that when we understand the context of what we're reading in full, any pre-made assumptions or expectations of what the text should or should not say about the homosexual community falls to the side. You see, if someone is stuck trying to pluck 2 verses out of context as a treatise for why Paul hates gay people, then I think that person has sufficiently shown an incredible lack of respect and knowledge for the Bible. To manipulate a verse or 2 into an anti-gay rallying call, that person has missed the point of the book of Romans, a book not bent on separating people, but Paul's work with Jewish and Gentile Christians to unify. And to our people a covenant, we would be wise to follow Paul in this way and do the same. Peace and blessings, everyone.